Okay, let's get started. So, the first case, the mail-in ballots case, is out of Mississippi. This one asked whether federal law requires that all mail-in ballots for federal, not state, but federal elections must be received by Election Day, or whether states can allow ballots that are postmarked by Election Day to arrive and be counted a few days later. Mississippi actually had a law permitting absentee ballots postmarked by Election Day to be counted if they were received within 5 days after Election Day, 5 business days after Election Day. The Republican National Committee sued Mississippi, and some other states got involved, some other parties got involved, arguing that federal statutes setting Election Day as the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November preempt state grace periods. Okay. So there's several laws that were at bar here. You're going to hear the majority and the dissent refer to three statutes over and over again. Those are 3 USC 1, 2 USC 1, and 2 USC 7. What are those laws? It's just the federal laws that set presidential election day and the laws governing House of Representatives elections and United States Senate elections. In a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court upheld Mississippi's law today. Justice Amy Coney Barrett wrote for the majority opinion, and she was joined by Chief Justice John Roberts, as well as Associate Justices Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson. Now, here's the core of the majority's reasoning in Barrett's own words, and I'm quoting. The defining element of an election, the term used in all three federal statutes, has always been the electorate's choice of candidate. The electorate's choice is made when voting is complete, not when ballots are received. The federal election day statutes require the electorate's choice to be made on election day. That occurs so long as election day is the deadline for individuals to vote, as it is in Mississippi. But the election day statutes do not set a deadline for ballot receipt. They do not prevent Mississippi from counting ballots postmarked before election day, yet received afterward. End quote. The court clarified, in other words, the court clarified that federal election statutes focus on when voters make their choice, like the physical act of casting the ballot, not when elections officials officially receive the ballot. States, in other words, retain authority over the mechanics of ballot receipt as long as the voting deadline is Election Day. Now, of course, not everyone agreed. Justice Alito dissented, and he was joined by Justices Thomas and Gorsuch, and partly by Justice Brett Kavanaugh. The dissent argued that historical practice and the statutes themselves require ballot receipt by Election Day to complete the election. Here's Justice Alito writing, quote, if ballots received after Election Day are added to the set of ballots that dictate the election's outcome, the electorate's choice does not occur on Election Day, and the federal Election Day statutes are violated. From this nation's founding until the last few decades of the 20th century, a period that spans the enactment of all three Election Day statutes, having an election on a particular day meant completing ballot collection on that day. End quote. Here's what all of this means going forward. This ruling preserves mail-in ballot grace periods in like 18 jurisdictions, most of them U.S. states, some places like District of Columbia as well. It's a significant win for state flexibility in election administration, and it's a setback for those that wanted to restrict mail-in ballots. I think we all know about the suspicions around mail-in ballots. There was a lot of mail-in ballots in the 2020 election. A lot of people still have doubts about that election. And whether there are doubts or not, you have to admit, whether those concerns are valid or not, that doesn't help. The perception of the mail-in ballots does not help, especially in a really close, maybe swing district election or in another very tight race. When you go to bed on election night thinking that Joe Schmo won, And then 2 days later, more ballots come in and Susie Chapstick pulls ahead. It's just not a good look. It's just not a good look to have these ballots coming in after election day. Now, of course, what the Supreme Court decided could be changed. The states maintain, according to the court's ruling, a lot of flexibility here. Mississippi, a red state, could just get rid of its mail-in ballot program. They don't have to have that anymore. Mississippi could return to you got to vote in person, or if you do vote, your ballot has to be postmarked a certain amount of days before election day. They could just do that. So the states have a lot of control here, and there's a little bit of power sharing when it comes to federal elections because Congress could also step in. Congress is really the final authority on how federal elections, and that's the operative part. This is only applying to federal elections. States can still do whatever they want, and states do all sorts of unique and sometimes kind of kooky things when electing governors, state house, state rep, state senate, blah, blah, blah. They have a lot of authority there, but this is only federal. And Congress is the final authority with federal elections in most cases. So Congress could step in and say, Mississippi, California, all of you have to do your elections differently. And at different times, Congress has stepped in and they have put in new regulations on federal elections. So they could do that. So this is a setback, but the political process can still work in those places, and either Congress or the state legislatures could still change things for people who are not satisfied with the ruling. And as someone who listened to oral arguments in this case and who read the statutes, and this is even kind of reflected in like the 5-4 nature of this decision. It was a coin toss. The statutes were unfortunately very vague, and so you kind of had to read into them something. And so I think the justices were put in a bad spot here. This was a hard one, and the political process can still work to resolve this. Now let's move on to some of the kind of more sexy elements of what was released by the Supreme Court today. So here's our second case, Trump versus Slaughter. This case tested whether Congress can limit a president's ability to remove members of supposedly independent federal agencies like the Federal Trade Commission. So, flashback to 2025, President Trump removed FTC Commissioner Rebecca Kelly Slaughter. She challenged it under a federal statute that allows only for, quote, removal for, quote, inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance in office, end quote. The lower courts sided with her. They sided with Slaughter. But today, in a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court reversed, holding that for cause removal protection is unconstitutional. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the majority opinion, and the court explicitly ruled that its 1935 precedent, which you would only know if you went to law school, and this case would have bored you to tears. It's called Humphrey's Executor versus United States. That case had upheld for cause protections for the FTC on the grounds that its functions were quasi-legislative and quasi-judicial. Here's the majority's key language from Chief Justice John Roberts. Quote, to remain accountable to the president, those officers must be removable by the president. The FTC unquestionably exercises executive power and must therefore be controlled by the chief executive. Subordinates who exercise the president's power are subject to removal by him. Then and only then can they remain accountable to the president and the president to the people. End quote. The ruling embraces a strong version of the unitary executive theory, which is basically that the president has strong control over removal of officers and most things done in his name in the executive branch. Okay. And that would keep him accountable. That would keep the officers accountable to him and ultimately the president to the people. Justice Sotomayor wrote a lengthy dissent, surprise, surprise, joined by Justices Kagan and Jackson. She argued that this discarded nearly a century of precedent and upended the structure Congress deliberately created when they created independent agencies and restrained some of the president's ability to interact with those agencies. Sotomayor wrote, quote, "Today, the court discards the democratic regime created by the Constitution in favor of one that distorts the structure of government to fit the majority's theory of unitary, total executive control. The result is a president who emerges with far greater power than ever before." End quote. Here's the political and legal significance of this. I think you're probably already this morning and probably in the future going to hear Sotomayor's opinion quoted a lot. And the argument will be that this ruling expanded the power of the president. Of course, the alternative viewpoint would be that this was always the power of the president and that Congress unlawfully attempted to restrain the power of the president by creating these independent executive agencies. And you may be asking yourself, God, why has Kellen said supposedly independent executive agency so many times? Well, this has been a debate in the law for a long time about whether we can even have independent executive agencies, because it kind of creates a like fourth branch of government if you do that, because there are these branches of government, there are these agencies that are not immediately accountable to the president, and to a lesser extent they're kind of accountable to Congress, but Congress doesn't have a habit of exercising their authority over these independent agencies a lot. So there's sort of this quasi fourth branch of government. And there may be good policy outcomes. This is distinct from a legal outcome, but there may be good policy outcomes that some would argue would come from this. You get more continuity of government, of policy, because these people stay so long, and depending on what role they have, they might have a 4-year, 5-year, 10-year appointment, and they make their decisions not under direct political pressure because they are not elected, and they mostly do not have interactions with superior elected powers like the president. But the countering argument to that would be that the founders of the United States never intended for there to be independent executive agencies. The president's full title is Commander in Chief Executive of the United States. So anything under the executive branch, anything executing an executive function, should be accountable to the president. That would be the countering argument. And that is the argument that has prevailed today. That is sort of the ethos that undergirds the majority opinion in this case. But you might be going, hey, 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 wait, the president has all the power over these executive agencies. I mean, they just gutted the FTC and the National Labor Relations Board and the EEOC and the Securities Exchange Commission. Why don't we just crunch those into the treasury? And that might happen, that might happen down the road. But didn't they just make a countering ruling with the Lisa Cook case? And let's break that down because it's not as clear. It's not as clear as maybe what you're reading online. So let's flash back. This is the third case today. Okay, this is Trump versus Cook, which has to do with the Federal Reserve and presidential removal. Very similar thing going on at the Federal Reserve. Okay, so this case involved President Trump's attempt to remove Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook, citing allegations of mortgage fraud, which Cook has denied. And the Federal Reserve Act contains a for-cause removal protection similar to the one in Slaughter. And in today's ruling, the Supreme Court prevented the immediate operative word, immediate removal of Governor Cook, keeping her in her position while litigation continues. The court distinguished the Federal Reserve from other independent agencies, citing its unique structure and critical role in monetary policy. I mean, we know all the stuff Federal Reserve does, most notably interest rates, the accursed interest rates, which have plagued our nation for the last few years. And while the Slaughter decision broadly expanded presidential power over removal authority over independent agencies, the court carved out an important exception in this specific case because of the way Trump fired Lisa Cook. He just tweeted, "You fired." I mean, it wasn't quite like that, but he just tweeted something about Lisa Cook being fired, and she was not given, in the court's view, a formal opportunity to respond to the allegations against her, to even review the allegations against her, and they didn't go through a process for removing Lisa Cook. She was just fired, you know? And so what the court is implying, possibly here, is that if they had maybe gone through a 30-day process of notifying Cook of the allegations against her, giving her a chance to respond, and then firing her, that might have been lawful. But she really wasn't given due process. And so this fundamentally is more of a labor dispute decision, I would argue, and it's really more of a due process decision. And so Lisa Cook is back in her job for now, but it seems imminent. It seems likely that very soon they will enact some sort of formal process and Lisa Cook will be fired again. And this probably will go back to the Supreme Court. And we'll see what they rule then. But at least for now, Lisa Cook has got her job back. So, taken together, Slaughter and Cook kind of create a two-tiered system for now, where the president has broader control over the independent federal agencies, with the exception of the Federal Reserve for now. So this has all been really big. This has been a big day. And of course, you may have listened to yesterday's podcast. And if you haven't heard it yet, I refer you back to it. You ought to listen to it. Made a prediction in the upcoming case of Trump versus Barbara, which is, of course, is the birthright citizenship case. It's going to be the biggest constitutional rights case in living memory. Go listen to it. That decision was not released today. You typically get the big Supreme Court opinions on Thursdays. So we still have a few more days as of the time of this recording. And so you can still hear the prediction. And maybe I'll look very smart if I was right. If not, don't forget about it. In any event, I invite all of your comments. Please drop your comments. What do you think of these rulings? Are they just? Are they wrong? Should Trump relitigate them? What do you think? Drop your comments below this video. You can also find me at Cowtown Caller on Twitter. And for those of you that receive this straight to your email, respond to the email. I read everything. And I love seeing what you have to say. This is Kellen McGovern Jones. I thank you for listening. We'll be back soon with more talk about current events and the Supreme Court.